know that you know that I couldn't resist just going a bit briefly into some of the theories behind justice and some of the ways to think about it. We're not going to directly examine this, so you could probably skip to the next podcast if you're not interested, but I think that that understanding some of these tools can be useful in helping you think about remuneration and any kind of distribution problem that you get involved with. So here we've got three different ways of thinking about distributive justice. The first one, our old friend, a utilitarian analysis, right? So they would suggest that a just system is one that maximizes society's utility or happiness. Okay, so that's the marker. If you maximize utility, then it's a great system. I think that this is the one that really drives economics and is behind agency theory, shareholder maximization, etc. It's all about how do we make the most money, which is a proxy for utility and economic efficiency. So a utilitarian perspective on distributive justice is some that say it is one that maximizes the utility for society, which in a governance sense is really maximizing the value of the firm and through the system. You could make an argument that maybe maximizing a firm doesn't maximize society, but the economists would argue with that the competitive dynamics within a well-regulated business environment is something that does maximize society's interest. The second theory that we have here is Nozicks Theory of justice. Now, Nozick was a really interesting philosopher. He was a precursor to the libertarians. And so the idea here is thinking about, well, when do you have a right to something? So the libertarians are really huge on your individual choice, on you being able to live your life how you want and freedom and those kinds of things. And intimately tied to that is the idea that you should minimise state interaction, particularly if that interaction forces you to give something up in terms of freedom. So economically, they'd say, well, with government, you want to minimise government. Like, why should the government have the right to take away your money to give to someone else? So, by the way, libertarians aren't against social causes and charities and things. They're just of the view that you should choose to do that. You shouldn't be forced into doing that. I think they do recognise that there are certain elements where you need a government, defence, law and order, etc. All of those things, you'll get free rider effects. But in other areas, well, let's look at one of the arguments. The classic argument that they use is to say, look, if you're going to have any form of redistributive economics, so essentially you pay tax and then you use that tax to get a social outcome, maybe pay for lower socioeconomic people. Part of the argument there is that you're taking money away from the people who had that money, right? So that's the core of the argument. And so, and then redistributing it and giving it to someone else. And just because the state does it, is it any different than if an individual robbed from someone and gave it to someone else rather than them giving it freely? And so the classic example that they use Nozick used was Wilt Chamberlain, who probably many people won't know, he's a very famous basketballer. And the idea was, well, imagine if there's a box sitting at the entrance to a basketball court, and over the course of a season, people going into the basketball court past the box. And there's a sign on the box that says donations for Wilt, right? And so imagine that people freely, as they're going into the basketball match, put, say, on average $5, and 1 million people go in. So at the end of that season, Wilt Chamberlain has got $5 million, right? Now, the classic kind of problem for them is say, well, what right does the government have to take that $5 million? I mean, people just gave him the money, right? There's There was no imperative on them. He's done nothing untoward to gain that money. So why should anyone be able to take that money away? By the way, there are lots of arguments against this that you can look in, like government supports the roads that lead to the basketball court, etc. But at the end of the day, it is about people making choices and whether people should be compelled to give up their money. Okay, that's a long way to get into the rules of Nozick, because Nozick also recognised that this idea of property rights, which is being fundamental to free choice, people can choose to give the $5 to Wilt Chamberlain, they can choose to go to the basketball match or not. So the basic idea behind that thought experiment is that what you have is a great deal of inequality in that system, right? So the Wilt Chamberlain superstar has earned $5 million and they're far ahead of all of the other spectators who've given it. So Nozick and the libertarian view is not so concerned with the equality of outcome, right? Because what they're saying is no one was coerced to do that, everyone gave it freely. In fact, the only way to make the distribution more equal in terms of outcome is to force Wilt Chamberlain to give up money, or he can voluntarily give some of it up back to the other people. Their view is that he should voluntarily give it up and should not be forced to give it up, because people have freely chosen to put the $5 into the bucket. And that's one of the ideas behind why libertarians believe that governments should have a minimal role. I mean, certainly there are roles for government in society, particularly around emergency services, defence, etc., that they'd all agree with. But once we get beyond that into this redistributive justice, it becomes, well, what right do we have to take money off someone and give it to someone else, right? Is that a just way of running society? And they would argue, based upon a free will and a freedom and an individual choice perspective, that we should try and minimise that in society. So Nozicks Theory, that's a long way of getting into the idea that Nozicks Theory is actually based upon two simple rules. Okay, so the first rule that Nozick has for what is a just, to know whether you're entitled to what you have, is that you're entitled to things you make or things that you gather from the wilderness. So you've got to go back a bit to where the libertarian comes from. But for instance, if you're a farmer, if you grow crops, something that comes from your own hands, well, then you're entitled to the harvest that comes from those crops. If you can go out and you own a block of land and you can chop a tree down and make a table, then you're entitled to the table, right? It's something you've done. The same way that if you produce labour, you're entitled to the wage that comes from that labour. Okay, so the first rule is you're entitled to what you've put effort into gathering or making. The second thing then is you're also entitled to anything you acquire voluntarily and without fraud. So if I then trade with you, if I buy something off you, and there's no fraud and I haven't stolen it and etc., well, if there's a voluntary exchange, then I'm entitled to that. And so it's all based upon this idea of what right of title do you have to the property as it passes down, to the fruits of the endeavour of people. And provided that there is voluntary transition all the way through this chain, you're entitled to what you've got. And it doesn't matter how unequal that distribution ends up. All he's saying is that the unequal distribution we have is a result of people's free choices. And the only way to overcome that is to compel people to do things that they don't want to do. And that's not something we should have in a government. So that's kind of Nozick's theory of justice, very briefly, of course, very briefly. Finally, Rawls' theory of justice. He's one of the latest philosophers, although Nozick wasn't too old either, it wasn't too long ago either. Rawls had an interesting thought experiment. So what he said is, the way we should run society is we should think about what kind of society rational people would want to end up in. And to do this thought experiment, he created something that he called the veil of ignorance. Right? So the veil of ignorance means you're on one side and you don't know what society is going to look like, but you have to agree to the rules before you enter the society. Okay, so we're going to set up these rules for society. And you don't know whether you're going to be smart or dumb, beautiful or ugly, athletic or non-athletic, disabled. You don't know anything about yourself, right? So, and then he says, well, if you don't know how you're going to function in that society, we can pretty safely logically work out the rules that you would agree to. And the rules that you would agree to is that distribution should maximize the minimum. Okay? So again, this is a very high level overview, but what does that mean? People would agree to the system that makes the worst off the best they can be. Okay. So what it is, even if we do have unevenness in society, provided the bottom person is the highest they could be compared to alternative systems, that's the system you'd agree to. So it's maximising the minimum position. He also did have another rule, and that's that anyone should be able to progress in the system. So you weren't excluded from being on top under the system. So there's equality of opportunity, fairness of opportunity there in terms of their system. And so that one's got a fair bit of legs recently about the system that we would use. So there's three different systems. I really haven't spent a lot of time. They're quite deep if you really get into them, and there's all kinds of nuance. For instance, a utilitarian system sounds very economically rational, dog eat dog, but it's not, right? Because theoretically under a utilitarian system, if redistributing wealth, right, if taxing wealthy to give to the poor people, well, that's probably going to increase society's wealth. So it would say high taxes are not necessarily a bad thing. They may maximise society's utility. So you've got to go into them to see the positives and negatives if you're really interested in the area. But I think it's useful just to go back to some of the classic philosophies and classic ideas that drive the way a lot of people see these distributive problems in the world. So that's probably enough philosophy and ethics. In the next one, we'll actually get into a bit of how do we apply these ideas of distribution, the idea of remunerating executives in the corporation.